Mayor Mamdani scrambles as protesters interrupt Related's $2 billion Hudson Yards Phase 2 financing plan. Jeff Blau stood on stage at the Real Deals NYC Real Estate Forum this week and said the words, "No developer gets to say lightly in this city." Hudson Yards, the largest private real estate development in American history, is 100% occupied. 15 years after breaking ground on what critics once called an overpriced bet on an unproven stretch of the far west side, Related Company's CEO stood in front of an audience of his peers and declared total victory. When we started marketing Hudson Yards 15 years ago, all I would hear from CEOs is, "Where is Hudson Yards? And why would I ever move my company there?" Blau told the crowd, describing conversations that once sounded like polite rejections dressed up as questions. He didn't get through his remarks quietly. Protesters interrupted him repeatedly, shouting "shame on you" from the crowd, not over Hudson Yards' occupancy rate, but over something happening 2 blocks away from the stage he was standing on. A roughly $2 billion city-backed financing plan that Related is pursuing to build the platform over an active rail storage yard required before Hudson Yards' second phase can even break ground. It was an unusual scene for what was billed as a straightforward industry victory lap. A room full of real estate executives applauding an occupancy milestone, while a separate, louder argument about who actually benefits from that milestone played out in real time along the back wall. Blau kept talking through it. "Despite the protesters, I'm committed to New York City," he said, and moved on to his next point, describing the office market as sitting at an all-time peak and insisting that companies keep coming here because talent wants to be here, regardless of how expensive or politically complicated the city becomes. But the interruption landed at a strange moment for City Hall, an administration that campaigned explicitly on skepticism toward exactly this kind of large public financing commitment to a private developer, and that has spent months positioning itself as the check on unchecked corporate power in this city's development pipeline. The mayor's office, notably, said almost nothing in response to the protest footage that circulated afterward, despite reporters specifically asking about the $2 billion financing plan's status in the days that followed. There's a number buried inside the City Council's own financing approval that never made it into a single headline covering this story, and it explains exactly why the mayor's office has said almost nothing publicly since Blau's comments went viral. You don't have to follow commercial real estate closely for this story to matter to you. Any city using public financing to unlock private megaprojects is running the exact same political tightrope New York is walking right now, between attracting the kind of investment that builds a skyline and avoiding the appearance of subsidizing billionaires while ordinary residents fight over affordable housing. Subscribe before we continue, because the number ahead comes directly from the City Council's own approved financing structure, and almost nobody covering the protest story actually dug into what that $2 billion commitment specifically obligates the city to deliver, regardless of who's mayor when the bill comes due. Here's the timeline. Hudson Yards' first phase opened in 2019, developed jointly by Related and Oxford Properties across a 28-acre site that Related spent 15 years marketing to skeptical CEOs who initially couldn't understand why anyone would relocate a headquarters to what was, at the time, a stretch of active rail yards on Manhattan's far west edge. It worked. Coach-parent Tapestry, investment giants BlackRock and KR, and Meta all signed on as anchor tenants across the 4 completed towers, 10, 30, 50, and 55 Hudson Yards. By this spring, Blau was standing on a stage declaring the entire campus fully leased, an all-time peak for New York's office market, describing Hudson Yards as having become, in his words, the center of business and commerce for the entire city. The success didn't stop at Phase 1's 4 towers either. Related is separately building 70 Hudson Yards nearby, where Deloitte plans to relocate its North American headquarters, a tower already about 60% leased according to the company. The firm is also developing 625 Madison Avenue on the east side, acquired from Essel Green, evidence that Related's New York ambitions haven't slowed even as the political conversation around large developers has shifted considerably since Phase 1 broke ground. Phase 2 was always the harder half of the bet. Building over an active rail storage yard requires constructing a massive platform first, an engineering and financing challenge on a different scale than building on solid ground, and one that Related structured from the beginning around a public-private financing partnership with the city. The City Council approved a roughly $2 billion financing plan to construct that platform, clearing the way for Related to eventually build an additional office tower, housing, and a large public park on top of it. The project only reached this stage after Related abandoned its separate bid for a downstate casino license the previous year, redirecting focus and resources back toward completing the platform plan that had been under discussion in various forms for years. That approval happened under a different administration, before Mamdani took office, but it obligates the current administration to deliver on financing commitments negotiated years earlier, at a moment when City Hall's entire public messaging strategy has shifted towards skepticism of exactly this kind of arrangement. Mamdani's signature economic message, a promise to tax the rich and hold large real estate interests more accountable, has already generated friction with other major developers well beyond related. Vornado Realty Trust CEO Stephen Roth delivered a pointed public rebuke of the phrase just this week, and Citadel, the hedge fund building a $6 billion tower at 350 Park Avenue, has signaled that its own skyline-shaping project is, in the company's own words, not a foregone conclusion. Related's Phase 2 financing plan is unfolding in exactly that same charged atmosphere, inherited from a prior administration but now politically owned by a mayor whose entire brand runs in the opposite direction from the deal he's obligated to see through. Here's what the protesters at Blau's talk were actually objecting to, and here's the part that didn't make it into most of the coverage. The $2 billion financing commitment isn't structured as a grant or a subsidy in the traditional sense. It's structured as city-issued bonds, backed by projected future tax revenue from the completed second phase itself. A mechanism designed so that the city's financing exposure gets repaid specifically by the economic activity the new development eventually generates, rather than coming out of the general budget up front. This kind of tax increment financing structure is common in large-scale urban megaprojects nationally, and it's specifically designed to let a city support transformative development without directly taxing residents to fund it. That structure works cleanly on paper as long as Phase 2 actually gets built and actually generates the projected tax revenue on something close to its original timeline. The bonds get issued now, based on revenue projections calculated years in advance, while construction itself takes years to complete and lease-up takes additional years after that. If the platform construction stalls, if leasing on the new tower comes in slower than projected, or if broader market conditions shift the kind of tenant demand Hudson Yards Phase 1 benefited from, the city is left holding bond obligations calculated against revenue that hasn't actually arrived yet, exactly the kind of arrangement critics of tax increment financing have warned about in cities across the country for decades, where a projected revenue stream that looked conservative on paper turns out to depend on market conditions nobody can guarantee a decade in advance. The protesters shouting, "Shame on you, weren't objecting to Hudson Yards existing." They were objecting to a mayor who campaigned on taxing large developers and holding them accountable, now presiding over a $2 billion bond commitment structured in a way that puts the city's own balance sheet at risk if related second phase doesn't perform exactly as projected, a risk that isn't publicly quantified anywhere in City Hall's messaging about the project, and one that sits uncomfortably alongside a mayor who has otherwise built his entire political identity on demanding exactly this kind of transparency and accountability from wealthy institutions. Step into the position of a construction worker who's been told Phase 2 mobilization is coming because the story stops being an abstract financing debate the moment you do. Trade unions representing the workers who will eventually build the platform, the tower, and the housing on top of it have been tracking this project's timeline for years, planning around an expected start date that shifts every time the financing conversation hits a new political snag. A union representative who spent the last 18 months fielding questions from members about when exactly this job actually starts doesn't have a clean answer, because the honest answer depends on variables. Bond market conditions, city council politics, the pace of platform engineering, that are entirely outside any single worker's control. Some of those workers have already turned down other multi-year commitments elsewhere, betting on Phase 2's timeline holding, a bet that looks considerably shakier after a week where the project's own developer got shouted down at a public forum by protesters specifically targeting its financing structure. The construction trades aren't the only ones watching closely. Small businesses that operate near the existing Hudson Yards campus, the restaurants and retailers who benefited from the first phase's foot traffic, have a direct stake in whether Phase 2 actually gets built on anything like its original timeline, since a stalled or shrinking second phase means less future foot traffic than the neighborhood's commercial rents were priced around when Phase 1's success drove up asking rates for the surrounding blocks. A retail tenant who signed a 10-year lease 2 years ago, based partly on Phase 2's promised addition of thousands of new office workers to the neighborhood's daytime population, is now watching a financing dispute play out in real time, with no clear sense of whether that projected foot traffic ever actually materializes on the timeline his own lease was priced around. Then there's the affordable housing angle, the part of Phase 2 that City Hall has actually leaned into publicly, since the plan includes housing units alongside the office tower and park. Advocates who've spent years pushing for exactly this kind of mixed-use requirement on major developments have a real stake in Phase 2, actually breaking ground, because the housing component doesn't exist independently of the office tower's financing. If the office portion's projected revenue underperforms and the bond structure comes under strain, the housing units built alongside it are tied to the same financing timeline, the same construction sequencing, the same platform that has to go up first before anything above it can be built at all. A housing advocate who has cited Phase 2's residential component in testimony, supporting the broader financing plan, is now in the uncomfortable position of needing the exact bond structure her own movement's opponents are protesting to succeed in order for the housing she fought for to ever actually get built. Multiply the construction union rep's uncertainty by every trade with workers waiting on this project, and multiply the small business owner's stake in Phase 2's timeline by every retailer and restaurant operator in the surrounding blocks whose rent calculations assumed a certain trajectory of growth. The $2 billion in bonds looks, on the City Council's own approval documents, like a clean mechanism that pays for itself through future tax revenue. Nobody in that approval process modeled, at least not publicly, what happens to the workers, the small businesses, and the promised affordable housing if the underlying revenue projections run into exactly the kind of political and market turbulence that a very public protest interrupting the developer's own celebratory announcement suggests might already be brewing. None of this means Hudson Yards Phase 1 was a mistake, or that Blau's declaration of 100% occupancy was somehow hollow. By every available measure, the first phase performed exactly as promised, drawing exactly the blue-chip tenants-related bet on 15 years ago, and reshaping the far west side into what Blau accurately described as one of the city's genuine trophy office clusters, alongside Brookfield's Manhattan West and Vornado's Penn District nearby. That part of the story is a legitimate success, and Blau earned the right to stand on that stage and say so, regardless of who was shouting from the back of the room. What remains genuinely unresolved is whether Phase 2, financed through a mechanism approved under different political conditions, and now proceeding under an administration whose entire public identity is built on skepticism toward this kind of arrangement, can actually deliver on the tax revenue projections the $2 billion in bonds depends on. Nobody designed a clear public accounting of what happens if it doesn't, and the protesters interrupting Blau's speech were, whether intentionally or not, pointing directly at that exact gap. The space between a financing structure that looks sound on a city council approval document and the considerably messier reality of whether a 15-year bet on future tax revenue actually holds up across a full economic cycle, several mayoral administrations, and a political climate that has shifted considerably since the original deal was struck. It's also worth saying plainly that Mamdani inherited this specific financing obligation rather than creating it, which puts him in a genuinely difficult position. Publicly skeptical of exactly the kind of arrangement he's now legally bound to help see through, unable to unwind a $2 billion bond commitment without stalling a project that thousands of construction workers, small businesses, and future affordable housing residents are already counting on. So here's the question worth sitting with. When a mayor who campaigned against exactly this kind of public financing for private megaprojects ends up presiding over the exact bond commitment his own predecessor approved, does he own the risk that commitment carries, or is that a legacy liability he inherited and has no real power to unwind without stalling a project thousands of workers and small businesses are already counting on? And does the protest that interrupted Blau's celebration actually change anything about the underlying math? Or was it simply the most visible expression yet of a tension that's been sitting quietly inside this financing structure since the day the City Council first approved it? Let us know where you land in the comments. And we're not done pulling this thread. Next, we're looking at exactly how the $2 billion in bonds gets repaid if Phase 2's leasing timeline slips the way Phase 1's once did, before Related eventually turned it around.